Does the Old Testament of the Bible say anything about liberty and justice for all? Well, I believe it does. Exodus chapter 23. So that's the second book of the Bible and the 23rd chapter. Welcome to the Whole Truth, where I'm taking you through the entire Bible because I believe that God's Word has the answers for our lives. But we've got to read it, and we've got to read it in context. So if that sounds good to you, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, and that way each day as we go a little deeper into God's Word, you get that new video. And today I've got seven commandments is what I'm calling them. 7 commandments about liberty and justice for all. And it actually starts with the first one in Exodus 23 and verse 1. You shall not circulate a false report. You shall not circulate a false report. How would we classify that today? We would call that gossip. But I want you to think of it like this. How would you not circulate a false report? How would you not gossip? You ready? Think about Facebook and social media for a moment. I know we're on social media right now. How easy is it to reach down and hit the share button? But the Bible warns to make sure that you're not circulating a false report. Make sure that you're being cautious not to help spread a lie. Listen, this is not a proverb in Exodus. This is God speaking to Moses, who's supposed to speak to the entire nation. And he says, hey, make sure that you don't participate in spreading a false report. Number 2, you ready for this? It's in the middle of verse 1, but it's the second commandment. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute, so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Do you see that? Don't put your hand in with the unrighteous. That was the first way he said it. Then he says, don't go with the crowd to do evil. Then he goes into the third one, but still in the same idea. He says that you shouldn't go after the many to pervert justice. Let's say it this way. Don't follow the crowd. Just because the crowd is doing it doesn't make it right. And I want you to hear this. When the crowd is pressuring everyone else or someone else, when the crowd is putting pressure and saying, this is what everyone is doing and we should be doing this, I want you to think about our year right now, 2020. How much have we seen this? That the crowd's doing something and so everybody is following suit. I want you to hear what God was saying. If what the crowd is doing is unrighteous, don't have any part in it. Don't put your hand in and be a false witness. Don't go along with the crowd. As he says in verse 2, you shouldn't follow the crowd to do evil. Or how about this way? Nor shall you testify in a dispute to turn aside after many to pervert justice. So how about like this? What about when the crowd says, well, we're doing evil because we want to prove the evil that somebody else has done? What does God say about that? Do you see? And let me say it to you this way. There's no freedom found when you have to do what everyone else is doing. Liberty and justice for all. And God says it this way. Don't follow after the crowd to do evil. Don't do that. That's the second commandment. Now, third one. This one seems a little out of place, but it's not if you think about liberty and justice. In verse 3, you shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Just because somebody is poor doesn't mean that he's right. That's how God is saying it. Let's say it this way for our third commandment. Don't show partiality, period. Just because somebody's in a bad situation, just because somebody's got a bad station in life, just because somebody's ancestors were wronged or their parents were wronged or they were wronged and they grew up in a bad situation, doesn't mean that they're right. You don't have to you should not show partiality to them simply because they've had a hard life or because they're poor or something of that nature. Listen, don't show partiality at all. Truth is truth. Justice is justice, whether or not the person is poor. And that also goes the other way if the person is rich. And God will do that here in a moment. He'll say this the other way. He starts by saying don't show partiality because they're poor in verse 3. And that's what we're calling our third commandment of 7 of liberty and justice for all. When we get a little further, I'll show you in the 5th one, I'll show you how God flips that around and says it the other way. We'll get there in just a moment. But for now, let's look at this 4th commandment. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you should surely help him with it. If you see your neighbor's donkey or his ox running away, you should take it back to him. If it's gone astray, go get it and help take it back to him. Now, we don't really have donkeys and ox today, but understand that number one, this was a man's personal property, okay? This was his livelihood. And what we're really seeing, what God is saying is this: don't stand back and watch as somebody else suffers just because they're your enemy or just because they hate you even. Jesus said it this way: do good to those who persecute you. Do good to those who do you wrong. God said in the Old Testament, he said this: if you see a man's ox or his donkey going astray or leaving, you should take it back to him. He said it this way. He said, if you see a guy's donkey and it's being weighed down by its load, it's fallen over and the load is on top of it, this donkey's going to die there. Don't just leave the donkey because, oh, well, that's the donkey of my enemy, and so why would I want to help him? Don't stand back and watch anybody suffer. If you want liberty and justice in your nation, we don't want to see anybody suffer, even if that person is our enemy. I've got a neighbor that doesn't like me very much, and I've got a dog, and my dog has a little collar that keeps him in his boundary in the yard. I live on a main road, and that's pretty important for us. Well, my dog's battery went dead, and the dog got out of his boundary, and I didn't know it, and he was wandering down the main road. My neighbor saw it, who does not like me very much, but he brought my dog back to me, knocked on my door, and said, hey, I found your dog wandering down the road. That's how we ought to be. We don't want to see somebody else suffer or somebody else hurt, even if that person is our enemy. That's not a good way to be. All right, number 5. This is the one I was telling you about a second ago. Look at it's in verse 6. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Ooh, first we saw this: don't show partiality to the poor, but also now we see don't pervert justice against the poor. Right? Read it again. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Don't pervert judgment against him just because he's poor. Just because he's poor doesn't make him wrong. Just because he's poor doesn't mean that he doesn't have a right to justice, and he doesn't have a right to liberty of his own. Now, read a little further with me. Look at this in verse 7. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. You know what this really means? You ready for this? This sixth commandment? Don't pervert justice at all, whether it's against the poor or the rich, whether it's for the poor or for the rich. He uses the idea of a bribe. He says, don't take a bribe, because a bribe blinds a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. You know, we live in a nation when justice is not always served as justice, but it's served as who could explain it the best, who had the best lawyers, who could pay for the best legal team. Tell me I'm not right. There are times in our nation that the wealthy are able to get away with something simply because they are wealthy. And it's also true that sometimes the poor suffer simply because they couldn't afford a better team, simply because they couldn't afford a better lawyer to defend them against this other lawyer. How is that ever justice in a nation? Remember, we're talking about liberty and justice in a nation, and I think that 2020 would have been better if we could have lived by the laws that God was giving his people through Moses the prophet. I've got one more for you, the 7th one. Are you ready? Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Our 7th commandment goes like this: don't oppress anybody, even if they're a stranger, even if you don't know who they are, even if your oppression of them doesn't harm you or your own people, still don't oppress them, because you know what it is like to be a stranger. You know what it's like to be oppressed. That God, talking to Israel, says, you know what it's like to be oppressed. Can I say it this way for us in America in 2020, getting ready to be 2021? Hate doesn't get rid of hate. Fighting fire with fire doesn't put out a fire. It only spreads it. It's not okay to hate somebody because they hated you. It's not okay to do wrong to somebody because they did wrong to you. Oppression will not drive out oppression. It won't work that way. Don't oppress anybody, period. As a matter of fact, we're told throughout the entire Bible that we're supposed to love others. We're supposed to love God first and foremost. And second to that, we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus taught us that we're to do good even to a stranger, even to those people who would do us harm. We should love others and oppress absolutely no one. So there you have it, 7 commandments about liberty and justice for all, found in Exodus chapter 23. You see, the Bible is applicable for our lives. I hope that you subscribe to the channel. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope I'll see you tomorrow with more of Exodus chapter 23. See you then.